Hello, my name's Greg Caruso. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Humanities Department at Corning Community College. I work mainly on free will, consciousness, much like yourself, Neil, and occasionally interested in issues related to science and religion, but want to introduce yourself?
I'm Neil Levy. I'm head of neuroethics at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. I work, as Greg mentioned, in free will and consciousness. I also work in many other things, applied ethics, philosophical psychology, a little bit of epistemology, all kinds of things. And we're here chatting about our shared interests in the role of consciousness in behavior and the way in which it might or might not play a role in underwriting moral responsibility.
That's right. And in particular, we're going to discuss your new book. You want to hold that up, perhaps, for people to see?
There it is, new Oxford University Press book, Consciousness and Moral Responsibility. Not the most novel of titles or innovative of titles. It's got one big advantage over most other books on the market. It's very short, 127 pages of text.
And well worth the read, I should say. Yeah. So we definitely share this interest in consciousness and in your case, moral responsibility. I have a book on consciousness and free will, and it seemed that people started writing about this sort of. There's this focus on this issue right now, but I think when I was working on my book, I started to have this feeling like there wasn't enough focus on this question. And your book does an excellent job laying out, I think, issues, problems, and challenges in the relationship between consciousness. Should I start by maybe just in my words attempting to summarize some of the themes, and you could correct me and expand on that?
Sure. It's always interesting to hear other people's take on.
Okay, so your book primarily sets out to defend what you call the consciousness thesis. And the consciousness thesis, just stated, I hope correctly, is that consciousness of key features of our actions, especially those that give it its moral significance, are required for moral responsibility. And they're required for moral responsibility because those morally significant facts are required so they can be assessed by and expressive of the agent themselves. And along the way, you also defend the global workshop theory of consciousness, and you use that to get at what you believe is a key role that consciousness plays, and that's the integrative role in integrating representations, making them available for subsystems. If you view a sort of modular approach to the mind with these distinct and kind of disassociable components, the global workshop theory allows us to broadcast some of this information, make it accessible to many of these different systems. And it has an integrative function, and you think that integrative function is key for moral responsibility. And you focus, you do a great job looking at some of the leading theories of moral responsibility, so you spend a lot of time looking at real self theories of moral responsibility, or what you call expressive theories of moral responsibility, along with control accounts of moral responsibility, like maybe Fisher's reasons responsive guidance control model. And you argue that these models, whether they explicitly say this or not, are or at least should be committed to the consciousness thesis. And you discuss a lot of cases where we're not conscious of certain aspects. If you're talking about global automatisms, sleepwalking and such, and then also into more everyday cases of implicit bias, and then there are cases where I think we're going to disagree. But these cases, like for example, global automatism with somnambulism as an example, would not fulfill the consciousness thesis, but also in these cases they're going to normally not attribute moral responsibility. We don't have enough integrative ability to assess assess the morally significant facts to make them expressive enough of the agent to hold that agent morally responsible. So, am I in the ballpark? of?
I think you're not just in the ballpark, but you're in the center of the diamond.
Okay.
That's a very good summary. Let me just say one thing. You uh, said earlier that you're interested in free will. I'm interested in moral responsibility.
Well, I didn't mean
I,
yeah.
I take these debates to be almost entirely extensional.
Yeah.
I understand by free will the power such that by exercising that power in the right kinds of circumstances, an agent is morally responsible. It's the control condition on moral responsibility. That's
Sure.
not quite universal in the debate, um, but it's near enough. So I think it's useful to talk about moral responsibility because intuitions about moral responsibility are much stronger than intuitions about, I raise my hand at tea, is that a free act?
Mm-hmm.
But I take it that our target is more or less the same.
Yeah, and I agree because I define free will as that power ability that's required for to hold agents morally responsible in the kind of desert-based sense, and I think we share, I think, a essential definition there. So I might go back and forth between free will and moral responsibility. But you also spend a lot of time talking about those people who reject the consciousness thesis. People like Scheer, Arplay, Smith, and I think you do a good job. I think far better than I tried to do in my book, because I defend, I think, something along the lines of a consciousness thesis as well. But you do a good job addressing those who reject it. To set up a difference, though, where we could maybe get to a little later, you address my view maybe in the conclusion of your book, where there's a kind of you walk a knife's edge, I think, and I want to get a little clear on where you are here with. So, you have people on one side that are going to reject the consciousness thesis, say it's not required for moral responsibility, and you want to argue that it is. I want to agree with you that it is, and I think it's really important the role that you lay out that consciousness plays and how it's key to holding agents accountable. But then, at least the way you view my account, my view would be that the extent of the pervasiveness of unconscious situational features, the automaticity, the adaptive unconscious, that it might be these unconscious processes may be so pervasive that nothing ever reaches or satisfies the consciousness condition or the consciousness thesis. You want to be somewhere in the middle of those, right? So you want to demand the consciousness thesis. Argue that those that reject it are rejecting it falsely, and that they are, or should be, or even maybe implicitly are committed to something like the consciousness thesis. But you don't want to go as far as sliding into skepticism, at least not for this reason. You are a skeptic for other reasons,
Sure.
but not for this reason, in the way that my view may take these developments in the behavioral cognitive neurosciences as perhaps showing that the unconscious processes are so pervasive that maybe this consciousness requirement can't be satisfied. Is that sort of a fair assessment where you are in the middle of that?
Right. So as you say, I walk a knife edge. I walk two knife edges because the other one is that, as you just mentioned, I am in fact a skeptic. So I'm in this kind of uncomfortable position of defending the consciousness thesis against people like you, and saying, no, we can be morally responsible so far as consciousness is concerned. But on the other hand, I actually end up in the same place, but for entirely different reasons, arguing that nobody can be morally responsible. So I don't think that's right.
Your last book, Hard Luck. All right. Right. In terms of my position, let me just put this on the table, and then we could fight over some of the differences, perhaps. But I would probably say I'm more of a skeptic. I'm probably closer to you than you may think. I mean, I'm probably more of a skeptic for the philosophical reasons, actually. And I take, the arguments that you've laid out, the arguments that Pierre Boom has laid out, and Strawson to the extent that he's a skeptic, and I take these to be very powerful and in themselves sufficient to establish, I think, free will skepticism for me. My book, I do spend a lot of time on the empirical stuff, a lot of time on consciousness. And I do make a claim in there. It may not be strong enough a claim, but my claim is sort of a conditional conclusion. To the extent that our actions are determined by automatic and unconscious processes, which I acknowledge is an empirical matter, to the extent that they are, to that extent, free will is an illusion. I just may think that they go further than you, maybe. So if I were to say, like, maybe our reasons for rejecting compatibilism is a good way to look at it, I would reject compatibilism for external reasons, like yourself, external attacks having to do with philosophical, purely non-empirical arguments, like luck arguments, like Piraboom's four-case arguments and such. But I would also spend, and I spend a lot of time also looking at what I would consider an internal challenge to compatibilism, which is that compatibilists, even on their own commitments, like reasons responsiveness accounts, Frankfurt's hierarchical accounts, that they might have a really hard time with all this empirical stuff that's coming out that appears to be what Thomas Nettelhofer calls the threat of shrinking agency, right? That we're shrinking the realm at which maybe the compatibilists could fulfill even the conditions that they stipulate. And this would be more of an internal criticism versus what I would consider an external attack on compatibilism. So I guess I would be a skeptic for both reasons. I would rely primarily on the philosophical external ones if I was pushed, but I do think there's enough of an internal challenge. And maybe compatibilists are coming around to finally seriously addressing it, but in the past it seems that they've just ignored issues about consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the compatibilist's best hope, and I'm using compatibilists in the way you are, which is not in fact a sense I'm entirely happy with, because I consider myself a compatibilist. So if you think that compatibilist is someone who thinks that determinism doesn't threaten free will, then I'm a compatibilist. But somebody who has compatibilism as a success view of free will, somebody who says that determinism doesn't threaten free will, and, by the way, we have free will, then I think their best hope is to resist the push to shrink agency and going in the opposite direction, make agency as expansive as possible by telling a story on which agency consists in the broad variety of processes that actually drive behavior, conscious and unconscious. And I think that's what somebody like Dennett is trying to do. So Dennett's response to Levitt is to say, well, Levitt's experiments indicate that certain aspects of the self that we think are out of the loop are very important, but out of the loop. And his response is to say, well, that's not what we should be identifying the agent with those important parts. Instead, we should be saying we are the loop. And to a large extent, I actually accept that story. So for me, consciousness isn't that interesting. People who hear that I'm defending this view about consciousness and as a necessary condition of free will, their immediate response is to say, oh yeah, well, consciousness is very special, it's really important, and it's essential for agency, it's essential for everything we value. There are people who take this view, people who defend it, and people who find it highly intuitive. And I don't agree with any of that. I don't find consciousness particularly interesting. I don't find it does a lot of work in what makes life valuable. And what I'm talking about when I'm talking about consciousness is something that buys you certain things rather than something that is itself all that valuable. What it buys you is the integration of all those parts that actually make up the agent. So I think it's very important at the outset to clarify that I have a sense of consciousness in mind that's quite different from the sense of that people who think consciousness is so valuable have in mind, and that's a functional sense of consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, and so like I'm glad you say that, and I'm glad to hear that because I think we actually share that. Um, as much as I write about consciousness, I pretty much view it in the uninteresting way that you might view it. And maybe let's make this clear. I think maybe at the beginning too. You make it very clear that you're not talking about phenomenal consciousness, and you don't even really need to address issues like the hard problem of consciousness or the explanatory gap problems. Um, you're primarily interested in what might be at least equivalent to something like access consciousness in Bloch's terms. Bloch's terms. Um, and for you, it's that kind of functional role that it plays in the integrative nature that we laid out earlier. That's really important here, at least in this discussion. But in terms of the phenomenal aspects, you don't really have to take a position. You don't necessarily have to impart it with any specialness or have to give an account of that. And so you sort of set that aside very early in the book, right? You put that as a separate issue.
Right. So when I say I've got a functional notion of consciousness, I'm not begging any questions. People, there's a big debate: can consciousness be functionalized? But when people ask that, they're asking about phenomenal consciousness, and I'm really genuinely uninterested in those questions. So I just don't take a view.
Okay, so let me maybe push on that first before I come back to some of the other maybe bigger issues that we disagree on. That how much can we really separate the functional? I mean, the question of phenomenology. I know you do it. First of all, I'm not completely happy with Ned Bloch's distinctions of phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, although I know they're very widespread and prevalent. People use those. I think, as you know, I defend the higher order thought theory of consciousness, and it's a little bit harder for me to always understand or translate my terms into the terms of, Bloch's distinctions. Bloch, for example, can have phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness, where for me, I don't think I want to even call that consciousness. The flip side is, and there's no real cases, I think, but he accepts like the zombie paradigm as a possibility where you can have access consciousness with no phenomenal consciousness. And if you want to fully focus on access consciousness or an idea or conception of consciousness, at least close enough to that, could you, on your account, allow for a completely morally responsible zombie?
I don't see why not.
Okay.
So, insofar as I think that this notion of something like access consciousness, it is very close to Bloch's notion of access consciousness. Bloch builds certain things into his notion that I wouldn't build in because I think they should be matters for empirical inquiry about whether the stuff we can report is also poised to play this kind of global role in behavior. Bloch just stipulates that. Insofar as that notion is doing all the functional work, then it seems to I'm not aware of any theory in normative ethics which requires anything over and above that kind of causal role. So there's a debate about whether phenomenal properties themselves have a causal role. But insofar as they do, then they simply fall in under the same rubric. Insofar as they have, if they qualia in the spooky sense, in the kind of sense that Denner wants to reject, they may or may not exist. As I say, I don't take any position on that, but they can't be functionalized in principle. So insofar as they can be functionalized, then I think they drive the behavior of philosophical zombies. Okay. It occurs to me, to a large extent, I could drop the word consciousness. I think there's good reasons to keep it because I think there's a historical pedigree to using the word like this. This is how Freud used the word consciousness, the same way as I do, roughly anyway. He wasn't talking about qualia. And I think that's the primary way in which consciousness has been used. But you could talk about working memory instead.
Okay.
The contents of working memory are available to report. The contents of working memory are what the neuroscience of consciousness probes by asking subjects, can you report the stimulus or not?
Mm-hmm.
And the contents of working memory play the functional role that I attribute to consciousness. That's not an accident. It's because
Mm-hmm.
The work on working memory, in fact, I think it just is the work on access consciousness. But I could drop the terminology.
Okay. But even though you think consciousness plays a minimal role, you do think it plays an evolutionarily essential role here in terms of integration. So
That's right.
you couldn't, for example, accept something which Flanagan once called the consciousness inessentialist thesis, right? Which is that any cognitive activity done by a particular cognitive domain that's done with consciousness could equally be done without consciousness. You don't think that's true? Conscious inessentialism.
No, unless it's consciousness, a phenomenal consciousness in
Yeah,
essentialism.
sure. But you do think
Uh,
consciousness is essential for the integrative functions. And
right. I mean, you could get an organism which is not integrated, and you could
mhm.
have no use for this kind of consciousness. As a matter of fact, though, I mean, evolution designs us as survival vehicles. All our genes are in it together. They've got to. There is a limited degree of defection within a single organism. You do get genes playing defecting roles against other genes, but that's very limited by the fact that they stand or fall together and they reproduce more or less together or not at all. So they've got to cooperate. So they build systems which are cooperative systems, and the way in which evolution has hit upon cooperation among the systems that compose us is through this kind of mechanism for allowing them to share information. That's the functional role of consciousness.
Okay. All right. So let's get into this issue. So we could distinguish at least three different types of unconscious activity, or three different ways of being unconscious of relevant facts. Okay. So we'll go, if we can, maybe we could go through these, and I think we agree on the first two. We may disagree on the last. So the first one would be global automatism, right? So here you have, as the best example, somnambulism, and these are rare cases. They're puzzling, you say, and a good example would be actually something that we both cover or discuss in our respective books, which is the Kenneth Parkes case, right? So this guy in Canada, I think it was Canada,
That's right.
gets in his car, asleep supposedly, right? Gets in his car, drives 14 miles or so, stabs to death his mother-in-law, strangles, I think, unconscious his father-in-law, and in the trial, ultimately, he's exonerated because of the fact that this was documented as a case of somnambulism. We both would say in this particular case he's not morally responsible. Is that correct? That's
right. And both the lower court and the Canadian Supreme Court found him not guilty. So that the law has its own internal logic. That's some evidence that the folk are in agreement about this case.
right. And just to put it into terms of your theory, he's not conscious in this. I'm sorry. He's not morally responsible because he doesn't fulfill a consciousness thesis, which would be required for him to assess and for these actions to be truly expressive of him as an agent.
Right. So when he responds to the knife, for instance, he responds to the affordances of the knife. He responds to the suggestions of use of a knife. This is what a knife is for. What he doesn't respond to, what he's incapable of bringing to bear on his action, is a whole range of stuff about him, about his values, his beliefs, his goals, which are situation relevant and which, were he conscious, he would bring to bear. So, for example, we know because his parents-in-law had younger children who were at home. We know that his mother-in-law screamed and, Ken, what are you doing? By the way, I know, was tempted to immediately think of stereotypical stories about people's relations to their parents-in-law, their mother-in-law in particular. In fact, he was closer to his mother-in-law than he was to his own mother. So she pleaded with him under ordinary circumstances that would have triggered various attitudes of his, which he would have brought to bear in assessing what he was doing. But because he wasn't conscious, only certain states of him were online. Only certain modules were capable of driving the behavior. And I think there's a strong case for saying that Ken Parks, wasn't the one who was acting. It was merely subsystems in him, which are partially constitutive of him, but not expressive of him.
Good. So, and you use the term action scripts. I like that term. And so he's working off of a bunch of action scripts that have been established through learning and over time to associate certain stimuli with certain responses, and the knife affords him a certain kind of. And he's doing sophisticated things. He's driving a car. He's stopping at red lights. He's turning when he needs to turn. He's not driving into things. But these can be things that are carried out unconsciously. But the thing that you think is important with consciousness is that consciousness allows us to also have more flexibility and to deal with novel situations, which isn't really present in these cases in the way that, or he wouldn't be able to deal with them in these cases because he's not conscious and aware and broadcasting it. And
Right, so his behavior is driven by these action scripts, which are triggered by relevant stimuli, and then they're ballistic in the language of cognitive science. They simply run to conclusion without any kind of responsiveness to novel cues.
And this case fails both of the leading theories of moral responsibility that you discussed. It would fail Fisher's guidance control because there's not that kind of counterfactual reasons responsiveness that he would be able to act on. And it fails, as you described a little earlier, it would fail the deep self accounts, I think, too, because we wouldn't ascribe this to Kenneth Parks, the person, the deep, the personal level evaluative kind of stuff. Okay, so we agree on that. So the next kind of unconscious situation could be a situation where we are creature conscious, where we're awake, we're normally conscious, but we fail to be conscious of a particular relevant fact, one that maybe gives the action moral significance. And here is where you talk about cases of implicit bias. And if I understand you correctly, I think we both agree that in this case people would not be morally responsible either.
Right, and here is where I think the folk intuition starts to pull away from.
Right. So I'd like you to come with me, and I'm glad we're on the same side of this. I think we're going to both, or you're especially going to get pushed back on number 2, on this second case. You want to describe the study with the implicit sexism bias? Or? Right,
this is a lovely study. It's much replicated. I know that philosophers have this suspicion about social psychology. I can reassure them this is a much replicated study. In this one, it's one of the many using CVs. So the subjects were given the CVs of 2 applicants for the job of police chief, 1 male, 1 female. And one applicant had a lot of street experience, that alert on the beat, risen through the ranks. And the other one didn't have very much street experience. But what they did have, and the other one didn't, is a lot of relevant formal education. So a degree in criminology and an MBA, I don't know what. And the subjects were simply asked, well, they were asked several questions, but the most important are which applicants should get the job and why. But they switched the gender so that half the subjects got the male highly educated applicant and the female one lots of experience, and the other half got the female highly educated subject and the male with lots of experience. Now, in both groups, chose the male applicant. And they justified that on the basis of the qualification that that applicant had. So half the subjects said, look, formal education's all very well, but for this job, you need to have someone who's got policing in their bones. They've really got to understand policing. This is the job of police chief. That's why I chose the male. The other half said, look, street experience is all very well. I mean, that's great in a cop, but you know, this is a job of police chief. Yeah. You've got to liaise with City Hall. You've got to administer a big budget. You know, you need a lot of formal education. Now, both of those are plausible stories, and in fact, were you or I to, okay, I should talk about myself. Were I to be in that experiment, I could well see myself reasoning in exactly the same way. The way it works is processes that bias the way in which I assess the evidence would cause me to judge that one applicant is better than another. And this kind of automatic biasing towards options is in fact an adaptive and unavoidable part of reasoning. There's lots and lots of evidence that people who can't do that, who don't have these automatic biases towards options, can't reason. And Damasio's patients are the famous example here. So there's nothing wrong with reasoning like that. In fact, it's both rational and unavoidable. So I'd be biased towards certain options. Then I tell myself a plausible story about why I'm biased towards those options, where that plausible story is itself a story to which I'm biased. So I have no access to the states which actually cause the way in which I assess options. And therefore, I don't assess that content, this is a sexist choice. Rather, what I assess against my values and attitudes and goals, principles and so forth, is that confabulated criterion. And I see that against that criterion, in fact, I'm managing my agency well. I can say to myself, gee, look, you know, I believe in affirmative action and I'd really like to give the job to a woman. But what can I do? The male is just so much better qualified, so clearly better qualified that I can't. And I think that would be an exonerating story, precisely because the sexist content of the action is not one that's accessible to me. It takes good experimentation to reveal that the choice has a sexist content.
Okay, so, right. So in this case, we're not conscious of the morally significant fact, which is the sexism. We're conscious of a confabulated tale of our sort of rationalization as to why we chose the male. And for that reason, we can't really assess it, and it can't be really viewed as expressive of the true agent. So the person is not morally accountable in this case.
Right. So it's expressive of the agent, quite the content that did come up for assessment.
Right. Right.
Maybe they're even praiseworthy on that basis.
Okay. I imagine we'll get pushback on that case because I think that you're right that begins to stress the folk psychological notion. But I'm on board with that. Okay. The third case is, I think, where you walk the knife's edge and you don't slide into something closer to my position, perhaps. The third kind would be a case where we're conscious. We're conscious, perhaps, of the facts that are relevant, but we're not conscious of how or that those facts are shaping our behavior. And this is where maybe the situational literature comes into play. So sitting at a dirty desk may lead us to make stronger moral judgments. Or playing a game in the room where there's a briefcase placed on a desk might cause me to play the game more competitively. These are actually all real experiments. Being handed a hot cup of coffee prior to having to work with a partner may cause me to evaluate that partner in warmer emotional terms. I'm conscious of the cup of coffee. I'm conscious of the briefcase. I'm conscious of the desk being dirty, but I'm not conscious that the cup of coffee, the dirty desk, or the briefcase is causing me to act or make evaluations in this way. I take it I want to say we're not morally responsible in these cases either, because they fail something equivalent, not your exact consciousness thesis, but maybe a version of something I would call a consciousness thesis, because they fail to be conscious of a certain set of relevant facts that are causing, motivating, influencing the behavior. You want to hold this group of people morally responsible. Is this correct? And so this is where we would differ, right? So my view seems to say that the pervasiveness is so broad of these unconscious influences that we can't escape them and can't meet then the consciousness thesis, and therefore all of these cases would be exonerating of moral responsibility. You want to say they're exonerating in the global autonomous states. They're exonerating in the cases where we're not relevant, let's say, of the implicit bias, which is the morally significant fact. But we are morally responsible in these other, which I think are very common, maybe so common that they're present in almost all situations, of situational influences, aspects that drive choices, evaluations, judgments that we remain unaware of. We probably also would deny are playing a role. I'd probably, and in many of these experiments, they do post-experiment interviews where they ask people, do you think, the dirty desk calls you to make those stronger moral judgments? And they would say absolutely not. Or were you aware that the briefcase caused you to play the game in a particular way? And they'd say, of course not. You think that we are responsible in these cases?
Right. Well, I probably put it more strongly than I should have in the book. I don't want to say that these kinds of situational primes can never exculpate. Nor, for that matter, do I think that in the earlier kinds of cases in which our judgments are driven by factors of which we're unaware, that we're always not morally responsible. Again, just insofar as the consciousness thesis is concerned. So I do think that there are cases in which we'd agree. There may be cases in which, for one agent, exculpating, and for another agent, it's not, even though the case is otherwise identical. A lot depends on two things. First of all, there are big empirical questions here. In a lot of these experiments, the effect sizes are not that impressive. So, for example, if you look at John Haight's work, famously discussed influences moral judgment. Now, I can't remember the effect size in the dirty desk experiment, which was a study in which he wasn't first author. I think it was about 30. It's one of those in which he takes to support his view. But if you look at the effect size in something like the famous, I think it's called Dan experiment, in which hypnotic suggestion was used to induce a disgust response to the word often. And subjects then confabulated, this is how he puts it, moral wrongness in a situation in which there is none whatsoever. In fact, although the difference is significant, he got the reportable finding, and deservedly so. We shouldn't overemphasize the import of the finding, because it moved people from judging that the action was in no way morally wrong to still not morally wrong. So it moved it on a 100-point scale from 7 to like 38, but still well below the midpoint.
Right, so, but there is a rich literature on situationism where, I mean, like the famous dime in the telephone payphone example. That one I remember the numbers being something like those who found the dime, something like 86, almost 90% of people actually stopped to help the person who dropped items in front of them. Where only 6% of those who did not find the dime stop to help. That's pretty substantial. And then you get
In fact, that's too substantial.
yeah, yeah, and then you get well, you get ones like well, if you look at say one of John Barg's examples of the priming for so we have three groups, a control group. We unconsciously prime one group about rudeness primes and one group about patience. So we got three groups. They thought they were doing a completely unrelated experiment, but the experiment was actually the priming experiment. And then they're told to go down the hallway, talk to Professor X, fill out some paperwork before they leave. They go down the hallway. He's in a mock stage conversation. The real experiment is to see how long it takes them to interrupt. The people who were unconsciously primed with rudeness primes interrupt almost immediately, a very high percentage, if I recall. Those who were primed with patience, in many cases, time out of the arbitrary limit they placed on it for ethical constraint purposes. It was 10 minutes or something. And they just waited. So, okay, so here's the case. We could use this as a test case. I'm not aware. I'm aware of my interrupting in the conversation or not interrupting. That's globally broadcast. I'm not aware, however, that the reason I'm interrupting is that I've been primed with rudeness primes or something. I'm not aware of that. I would deny later in post-experiment interviews that those earlier experiments had any effect on my decision. And it seems very much like, to me at least, like the implicit bias case. What I'm aware of is my confabulated explanation. What I'm aware of is the confabulated story, oh, I'm really in a rush. Like, I really got to get out of here. That's why I'm interrupting. Or, so would you say that in this case, is this exonerating or exculpatory?
Again, the different story might need to be told for different agents.
Yeah.
So it's very important that the person is aware, not of why they're interrupting, but that they're interrupting, and they're aware of the significance of the fact they're interrupting. So they get the chance to assess that fact, that I'm interrupting this conversation, in the light of their values. And it is important here that the action is something that does seem to fall within the range of the morally permissible. So it doesn't seem to have shifted anyone from acting in a way which, on reflection, they would think is incompatible with their values. What in fact seems to have happened is it biased the processing of the situation in such a way that they thought that rudeness was a little less uncalled for in this circumstance. So no doubt they perceived the professor as slightly more dismissive or contemptuous of them for continuing their conversation than they would have otherwise. But it didn't cause them to act in a way that is out of line with their values. Now, I think you can get stories.
Well, let me stop you for a second, though, because on a Fisher-like counterfactual reasons responsive account, maybe we could say a case, or at least you're right, it might be different for different people and different agents, but I could imagine cases where if someone were conscious of the relevant facts in the situation, they would have acted differently and been responsive to different sets of reasons, to be more patient, to wait a little longer, to let the person finish what they were saying. And in that case, maybe we failed to fulfill that reasons responsive criteria for moral responsibility in a case like that, at least under that description of how I would you say that? Or?
I agree that the reasons to which the agents respond are going to be different depending on the primes to which they've been exposed. But they still satisfy the Fisher and Revizor story on both possible worlds, those in which they've been primed with rudeness and those in which they've been primed with politeness. Because in both cases, they satisfy the reasons receptive and reasons reactivist criterion. They're receptive to reasons, they recognize them as reasons, and there's at least one possible world in which they would actually react to some of the reasons to which they're receptive.
I guess for me, if the reasons are themselves sort of outside the realm of conscious access. Like in this case, the reason of interrupting might be that I'm short on time or something. So that might be my reason to interrupt, and that's responsive to, I guess, reasoning itself in some way, but maybe not if the prime was sufficient enough to suppress any countervening reasoning I would have introduced in this situation, right? I mean, there might have been other reasoning if I had not been primed for rudeness in this case, that I would have been able to be more receptive to those alternative reasons than the time constraint, and would have acted differently in that situation, would have been responsive to different reasons in that situation if I had not been situationally driven to be,
Right. Right. Now, so it's an empirical question. I think the experiments that come to mind as fitting the kind of description you've just given are experiments in which I think my story works. So if you think about the Good Samaritan study,
yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
So here people are under time pressure, and they don't respond to something that you think, especially since they're seminarians, they should take as a reason for responding. They don't respond to somebody slumped in the doorway, apparently in a bad way. They don't even, tell anyone. They don't even say, "Oh, can you check out this person, or can you call an ambulance or anything?" Now, there's some recent evidence that at least compatible with the suggestion that they just don't notice the person when they're under time pressure. So there's a recent study on the subjects were just told to jog following another jogger and count the number of times he touches his cat while they're jogging. And meanwhile, the experimenters staged an assault just off the path. And even in well-lit conditions, about half the subjects didn't notice the assault. They literally didn't notice the assault. And in twilight conditions, almost no one noticed it. And that also fits with the work like the famous gorilla experiment.
Yeah, the gorilla,
which people are asked to count the number of times a basketball is passed. And meanwhile, a man in a gorilla suit saunters across the court, stops mid-court, beats his chest, and then saunters off. About 40% of subjects don't notice the gorilla. Now, insofar as that's right, then this kind of case fits the paradigm of case 2 of the failing to be conscious of a morally significant fact. And then my exculpatory story just kicks in.
But all right, let me push you then. I'll come back to situational context maybe in a second, but let me switch to something like ego depletion. Baumeister's work on ego depletion and others. Let's take a case that is morally significant, that's real life. There's some evidence, right, these studies that seem to suggest, I think that maybe this was done in Israel, if I remember correctly, that judges, in terms of parole hearings, would be more likely to grant paroles in the earlier part of the day. Like your best bet, if you want to be up for paroles, to be the first person perhaps to see the parole board. But as you got closer to lunch, if you use a kind of ego depletion analysis here, there was a depletion of ego, there was a depletion of ability to, essentially there was a kind of overtasking here, where the default position becomes something like, well, don't do anything that is too risky. So in this case, relinquishing a prisoner or giving them parole would require more ego, more effort than it would be to just deny parole. So as you get closer to lunchtime, it turns out these people tend to have lower chances of getting parole. And it turns, I think there's a bit of a spike after lunch again where it might be good to go see the parole board, and then it depletes again. Okay, so in this case, I am conscious of the reasons that I'm deciding to grant parole or not grant parole. But am I conscious of, or am I conscious in this case of confabulated tales? Am I confabulating it just like with the implicit bias case? That really what's going on, something like implicit bias, you pick the male, candidate, and then you figure out what reasons you have for picking the male candidate. Either it's because they were streetwise or because they were well educated. And once you flip them, you would come up with different reasons, but you're still going to pick the male candidate. Well, is it the case in this case that I'm denying parole, and then my reasons that I give myself for denying parole are confabulated reasons based on risk of this prisoner and chance of repeat crime and recidivism or something? If that is the story, would you say these cases would not bear more responsibility?
Yeah, that's an interesting case. I'm a little worried that if in this case both of our intuitions, the sets of intuitions we both bring to bear, are going to be a little outside the mainstream, because I suspect we're both of us not particularly big fans of the criminal justice system. Yeah. So we may, in fact, think that the judges should have a greater bias towards granting parole than the judges would themselves accept. I do think it's a case like the one you've described is a possible case in which we should say that the situational factors are exculpatory. A lot depends on what is in fact going on in these cases. What are the details? Is it the case that the judges regard them all as pretty much close calls, so that they think that were I to flip a coin for each of these cases and make my decision on that basis, I wouldn't be doing the defendant an injustice. I know people who defend views just like that. Anthony Duff, for example, defends a view like that. He says, if you come up before court for exactly the same offence, you're found guilty, one judge might grant you parole, another one might incarcerate you for 5 years, and it's a matter of luck which happens, but they're both perfectly acceptable responses to that set of circumstances, so you've got no right to complain. Now, if the judge accepts a view like that, then they're acting in accordance with their own values. And perhaps they
are responsible in that case.
Yeah. But if it's the case that the confabulated reasons, and I agree with you, that's a plausible story about what's going on, that the judge is seeing one prisoner as more dangerous, and the reason they're seeing them as more dangerous is because they haven't eaten for a while, and you accept the Bowmaster story. I don't, as it happens. They don't have enough glucose in the system to engage in ethical processing. Then maybe there should be a story in which you're going to say that they're not acting in a way that's morally responsible.
But then I wonder how well you could prevent the slippery slope slide into something like a more skeptical position for these reasons, the consciousness thesis reasons. Because it seems really widespread. I mean, if you add the fact that it's about ego depletion, it's about the color of the wall, it's about the temperature of the cup, it's about whether I meet someone on a park bench or a suspension bridge, if there's a briefcase in a room or a backpack. How much confabulation might actually be going on in all of these cases to some important degree? And I wonder, you don't talk a whole lot about introspection other than to say that you sort of agree with me that there's no good reason to think we have transparent awareness anymore, or that there's a kind of infallible, introspective, immediate, transparent, infallible access to our own mental states. But when you have to defend some slightly stronger account of introspection to defend the consciousness thesis against skeptics like myself, to the extent that...
I don't think so. So I hope not, because I've talked about introspection elsewhere, and I'm an introspection skeptic. That is to say, I think that I think not only do we not have infallible access to our own mental states, I think our access to our mental states is largely via some kind of self-interpretive
That's
story,
right. Yeah.
some kind of self-interpretive route, rather than through looking what's going on inside. So what matters to me is not that I know what mental states I brought to bear in assessing the judgment. What matters to me is that the right range of mental states have been brought to bear, the right range of modular processes. I needn't have, and typically don't have, any good access into the processes underwriting that. So it's a very externalist story. It's a story that somebody else may be in a much better position to apply to my behavior than I am. Precisely because I'm confabulating.
But then if there's a lot of this confabulation going on, how different are these third cases to the second? I mean, it seems like what got us to exculpatory moral responsibility in the second case was that we were not conscious of these. We were conscious of the confabulation of the sexual bias or sexist bias, sorry, and not conscious of the bias itself, which would be needed to jive with my personal level evaluations and such. But what about just the typical example? This is kind of common type example where there are these studies that suggest that people will spend more money on a bottle of wine if classical music is being played in the liquor store than if top 40 or rock and roll. And I don't remember the exact number, but maybe it's say 10% more they would be willing to spend on the bottle of wine. Let's say, okay, so here, let me see if I can spin one on the fly here. So let's say I'm generally the real selfie, right? Let's say I'm generally the kind of guy that people expect going to bring a bad bottle of wine to dinner. And I'm the dinner guest that they invited over, and they're like, oh, we'll make sure we have an extra bottle of wine because Gregg always brings that $10 bottle of wine that no one could drink, right? But today I go in and the classical music's playing. I'm looking at the shelf. I'm aware of the more expensive nature of this bottle of wine compared to the one sitting next to it. But I decide today I'm gonna buy the more expensive bottle of wine. Now we could say if we're looking at it in this way, if I'm describing it, that the reason I'm really spending the more money is because of the situational influence of the classical music, right? Am I praiseworthy in this case where I go to the dinner party and I bring the more expensive bottle of wine and I'm like, oh, great, whoa, what a great bottle of wine you brought today, right? And normally they're expecting one thing, but today I seem to, have stepped up and actually brought a drinkable bottle of wine. Do I deserve that praise for that in this case, which I guess we could see as a moral action of some sort? Even though I'm conscious of the reasons that I was thinking of when I decided to buy a more expensive bottle of wine, I'm not conscious of the fact that, I'm not conscious of the fact that it's the classical music. I'm also maybe conscious of the confabulated story that I might be telling myself at that moment of why I want to spend more money today, and not truly aware that in a counterfactual situation where there were different music, I would not have had those. Is that a case where you would say it's praiseworthy?
So I think it's very important that this is a very empirically driven view.
Yeah.
I'm going to claim that cases like this are not cases in which the situational primes are very rarely cases in which we can get you to act out of character. So
but here's the case I described it, so I am.
That's
disallow the case.
I think I'm rejecting your description of the case. Yeah, you might. After all, it's a 10%.
It could be plausible. Right? It could be a plausible case where, I had a friend who used to bring cheap bottles of wine all the time. If he brought a nice bottle of wine, I might think, wow, what a great thing that he did today. Not his normal self, it seems.
The effect size as you described it is 10% more. So, the $11 bottle of wine is not that much better than the $10 bottle.
All right.
And you're not acting out of character. But I don't think we can. It's rare that a situational prime will cause us to act out of character, except by bypassing our assessment of the nature of the act in which we're engaged, rather than by causing us to confabulate the reasons for which we're acting.
Okay.
It's also one thing I did want to mention is the story I'm telling, and I think the story you're telling, is a story about direct moral responsibility.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
So agents can fail to satisfy these conditions and still be morally responsible because they've done things to inculcate these kinds of dispositions in themselves. And that kind of inculcation, not under that description, I don't know about you, but I never think myself today I'm inculcating a disposition to respond in a certain way. But still, I'm aware of what I'm doing, and I'm also aware consciously that what I'm doing has certain downstream effects on my character. So given that we can look at the history of agents in assessing their degree of moral responsibility, in principle, we'd have to find the facts that make them morally responsible in the situation. And that gives us some leeway for saying they can be morally responsible, despite the fact that there's a lot of confabulation going on.
Okay, I mean, I guess I wouldn't run this objection.
They're responsible for the way they respond.
Okay, yeah. I guess I wouldn't run this objection because it's not something I agree with. But I imagine there are people out there who could question if there really is a deep self in this way, or what you might call a character. I mean, you have the early attacks on some people take the situational literature, not myself. I think Stitch does, and maybe some others, to actually show that there is no set character in these cases at all, to really talk about that. We're just sort of a bundle of situational virtues or actions that are stimulated at the moment, from the dime or the Good Samaritan. I don't think I'd go that far. I mean, I wouldn't maybe push that line, but it does seem that if that case could be made, then I think we might be in trouble in some of these. I mean, combining the stuff that we're pushing and the argument we're giving, despite our slight differences on the third case, combined with that kind of skepticism would really wreak havoc, I think, on either of the prevailing theories of moral responsibility, or at least definitely the deep set, the self accounts.
Right. Right. So it's important to me. I don't know what character means, but it's important to my story that people have relatively persisting and relatively stable sets of goals and principles and attitudes. If they don't, then it can't. My story, on which it makes a lot of difference whether they've assessed the action in the light of those goals and principles and attitudes, just doesn't get a purchase. So if the situationist story does undermine that claim, then I'm in trouble. Okay. Of course, I'm not in the worst trouble in the world because I'm forced to skepticism, which is where I started. So, and I have never relinquished.
So we're getting towards the end because I think we're getting past our time. But can you I'm curious, what was the motivation for writing this book, given that you already are a skeptic? You've made a very strong case, I think a very persuasive case in Hard Luck, for why there can't be moral responsibility, and it doesn't depend upon determinism or even any of the scientific accounts. Why take this line to defend something like the consciousness thesis? Is it because you feel like there's something in the literature that is being missed here, or is it should we be paying more attention to consciousness in terms of questions? Or, well, I'm just curious why take this line? And it might be hard for a reader who doesn't know your general overall position to mistake you arguing in favor of a very kind of compatible, a very positive account of moral responsibility in this book.
Yeah, so in discussions of this book, I always just find it easier to pretend I'm an ordinary compatibilist. What's the motivation? Well, there are two sets of literature which I'm responding to. One is the work coming out of social psychology and cognitive neuroscience on consciousness, which has been interpreted by a lot of people as showing that because we're not conscious of our volitions, we're not responsible for our actions. And then there's a whole literature replying to this stuff. So, Al Neely, for example, has a whole book on this. It's a very nice book, but I'm puzzled by the motivation in replying to it, because it never seemed to me where the action was.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought it was important to reply to Levitt or Wegner, simply because the role that they say consciousness can't play is not a role that I think it ever needed to play. So I wanted to try to reorient the debate insofar as you worry about the neuroscience of consciousness and work on agency coming out of social psychology and cognitive psychology. I think there are more interesting things to talk about than Levitt. So that was one motivation. The other is entirely independent, very unempirical literature on new elaborations of the real self view. Because, George Scher, I think, says that most philosophers have thought consciousness was necessary for moral responsibility, but they never actually talked about it. They just kind of gestured towards it and said, oh, yes, of course, consciousness. But then recently, people like him and Naomi Arpely and Angela Smith and Tim Scanlon have started to actually look at it, and they've looked at it and said, well, actually, it turns out it's not important. But they, on the other hand, actually do cite the more relevant cognitive science, but they cite it in a completely throwaway line. So I wanted to actually say, okay, here is the cognitive science that's relevant. It really is the stuff of confabulation of reasons, just as somebody like Arthur says, or the stuff on implicit attitudes, which I know Angie Smith is working on very interestingly right now. But let's see what it actually says and situate it inside the broader context of the cognitive neuroscience and the social psychology, which is a very rich literature on conscious processing. And it's only in that context, only when we have that empirical background, that we can actually start to make some progress on these questions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I think your book is a great contribution to that literature and refocusing, because it does seem to me that whenever the scientific challenges to free will are discussed, it's always the limit, it's always the neuroscience. Whereas I think a lot, for my money, a lot of the more interesting stuff is the stuff that you're writing about in terms of the the social psychological literature and implicit bias and situationism, automaticity, and stuff. So, if anything, I really hope that your book brings attention to those questions and at least gets people thinking. I mean, it does seem that there's two different sides that need to address your challenge, and I think the Shears, Smiths, and those people who deny the consciousness thesis have, I think, to really take the consciousness thesis seriously. And I think compatibilists who have largely just sidestepped issues about consciousness because they thought they weren't relevant, probably because they've already thought, well, we've already established or taken for granted or argued for the fact that determinism is consistent with free will, and this is just further proof of determinism, like unconscious processes are taken for them perhaps to be just further evidence that there are deterministic causes for our actions. But since they weren't worried about that in the first place, they don't really need to be worried about this new literature. I think your book, and maybe hopefully to some small extent my book, is an attempt to say, no, I really do think you need to take this stuff seriously, because there is at least a concern of shrinking agency here to a degree, and maybe to a large degree, and maybe we disagree to how far that extent goes, but I don't think it's something that can be avoided in terms of really getting deep into the discussion about moral responsibility to have to address the challenge, I think, that you lay out. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Compatibilists often want to present themselves as talking about the necessary conditions for free will in all possible worlds. And that's fine, insofar as that's your goal. You don't need to talk about this stuff. But if you actually, maybe once in a while, it's actually interesting to ask about us here on this world. And insofar as you're actually concerned with real agents, you've got to get involved in messy empirical details.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun for me. So thank you,
Greg. It has been.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.